My sister changed the security code 8 days after we buried our parents. I was standing outside the Marina office at 6:18 on a Monday morning, with lake fog crawling over the docks, and my fingers already stiff from the cold. The old code was my father's birthday. I typed it once. Nothing. I tried my mother's. Nothing. Then, the fuel dock code, the winter storage code, the emergency code we only used when storms knocked the power out. Nothing. Through the glass, I saw Tessa before she saw me. She was standing behind the front desk in my mother's blue-gray cardigan, the one Elaine Whitlock wore every morning when she balanced cabin receipts with a mug of tea beside her. Tessa had the mug, too. Lake Mom, faded red letters, chipped on the handle. She lifted it like she belonged there. I knocked once. She looked up, smiled without warmth, and opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. "Everything is mine now, Maren," she said. "The house, the cabins, the marina, the accounts. You can pick up your boxes before dark." I didn't answer right away. Behind her, I could see the appointment card for Dad's last cardiology visit, still pinned to the corkboard. Mom's red pen was lying beside the booking ledger. The brass bell over the door was quiet. That was the part that hurt most. Not the lock, not the code, not even my sister wearing grief like a costume. It was how quickly she had stepped into a life she had not helped carry. Tessa thought my parents had left her everything. The house, the money, the name on the mailbox. But what she didn't know was that Samuel Pike, our family attorney, had a second envelope in his leather briefcase, and inside that envelope was the one thing my sister had missed. $19.2 million. And my name. To understand why that envelope mattered, you have to understand what Whitlock Harbor was before anyone ever attached a $sign to it. It was not a resort. Not really. It was too old for that word, too stubborn, too patched together by hands that knew how to fix things instead of replace them. Whitlock Harbor sat on the northern edge of a Michigan lake most tourists drove past on their way to bigger water, 12 cabins tucked between white pines, 42 boat slips, 2 long winter storage buildings with metal roofs that snapped in the January wind, a fuel dock that smelled like gasoline, lake mud, and sun-baked rope from May through September. My father bought the place in 1988, before I was born, when it was 4 leaning cabins, 1 crooked pier, and a rusted fuel pump that only worked if you kicked the side panel twice. Roy Whitlock was not a businessman then. He was a boat mechanic with cracked knuckles, a Coast Guard auxiliary jacket, and the kind of patience that made people trust him before they trusted his prices. He rebuilt the first dock with lumber he hauled in himself. He replaced the cabin roofs one at a time. He painted the office blue because my mother said the old brown made the place look like it had already given up. My mother, Elaine, was a nurse at the community clinic. She knew blood pressure numbers, prescription schedules, and which widowers lied about eating real dinners. When she came home, she ran the front desk like every guest was someone she had been expecting all year. She remembered who needed the cabin without stairs. She remembered whose husband had passed the winter before. She remembered that Mr. and Mrs. Callahan from Lansing liked Cabin 9, because the morning sun came through the east window and made the whole room gold. That was the thing about my mother. She could turn a reservation book into a family album. By the time I was old enough to help, Whitlock Harbor had become the kind of place people returned to without checking the rates first. Retired couples came every July. Veterans came for the fishing weekend Dad hosted after Labor Day. Local kids got summer jobs, cleaning boats, stacking towels, and learning how to show up on time. Nobody got rich from it in those early years. But bills got paid. Boats got fixed. Kids learned work. Older couples had somewhere familiar to sit by the water and remember who they had been before life got heavy. I grew up behind that front desk, doing homework under the corkboard where Mom pinned weather notices, unpaid invoices, and handwritten notes from guests who still mailed thank you cards. I learned to read weather by the color of the lake. I learned which dockboards creaked, which cabin heaters clicked before they caught, which guests needed help carrying coolers but were too proud to ask. I did not know any of that would matter someday. I did not know knowing the small things would become proof. Tessa learned those things too, once. She knew the sound of dock chains in October and the smell of wet pine after a storm. But somewhere around high school, she started calling it all small. Then she decided remembering this place was the same as being trapped by it. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 6. If not, type 8. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. By the time I was 24, Tessa had already turned, leaving into a personality. She lived in Scottsdale by then, posting pictures from rooftop brunches and open houses, with white countertops and desert sunsets behind her. Every caption sounded like a lesson. Choose growth. Choose freedom. Choose the life that chooses you back. I was in Grand Rapids, 2 semesters from finishing my healthcare administration degree, when Dad called me from the Marina office and tried to pretend he was not scared. His voice had that careful steadiness men use when they are holding bad news with both hands. He said Mom's kidneys were worse. He said his cardiologist wanted more tests. He said they had it handled. They did not have it handled. At first I came home on weekends. Then Fridays became Thursdays. Then I started taking Monday morning classes online, so I could drive Mom to dialysis before sunrise. I kept a change of clothes in my car, a stack of insurance forms in the passenger seat, and a cooler full of sandwiches because hospital cafeterias were expensive, and Mom hated watching me spend money. Tessa called once during those first few months, from what sounded like a restaurant patio. I remember because I was sitting on the laundry room floor, sorting Dad's pills into a plastic organizer marked morning, noon, evening, bedtime. Mom was asleep in the recliner, with a blanket over her knees. Dad was in the garage, pretending to fix a motor he had already fixed twice. Tessa said, "You're closer, Maren. It just makes sense." 4 words can be a door closing. It just makes sense. After that, everything became mine to remember. The cardiology appointments, the lab results, the Medicare notices that arrived in envelopes designed to frighten people, the cabin deposits, the payroll checks, the fuel deliveries, the guest who needed a refund because her husband had fallen, the winter storage contracts Dad kept meaning to review. Nobody sat me down and said, "Give up your plans." Nobody announced that I was now the responsible daughter. It happened quietly, the way leaks happen under sinks. A drip here, a towel there. Then one morning, you open the cabinet and realize the floor has been soft for months. That summer, Tessa came home for the 4th of July, wearing gold earrings and a linen dress that looked wrong beside the picnic table. She told a group of guests she was consulting on luxury properties in Arizona. They were impressed, people always were. When Mr. Dempsey, a retired firefighter from Traverse City, asked what I was doing now, Tessa laughed lightly and said, "Maren helps Mom and Dad with the little motel thing." The little motel thing. I was standing at the kitchen counter, cutting Mom's pills in half with a dull blue splitter. I looked up. Tessa had already turned away. Mom saw my face. She waited until everyone went outside for fireworks. Then she touched my shoulder and said, "People who leave usually get better stories. People who stay keep the real ones alive." I did not know she was quietly keeping track. I thought she was just trying to keep me from breaking. I was wrong about that. My mother was quietly keeping track of everything, and she kept doing it until the last week she could still hold a pen. Dad went first, on a Thursday night in November, while the first real cold of the season moved across the marina. He had been in his recliner with a blanket over his legs, the television on low. A Tigers rerun playing like summer could be called back if you listened hard enough. I was in the office closing out winter storage invoices when Mom called my name from the living room. Not loud. That was what I remembered later. She did not scream. She said my name once, in a voice so small it made my whole body move before my mind understood why. By the time the ambulance lights washed red across the front windows, I already knew. Mom sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around Dad's Coast Guard mug, staring at the place where his chair had been. The paramedics spoke gently. People always speak gently when there is nothing left to change. 11 days later, Mom followed him. She had been tired in a way sleep could not touch. The hospice nurse said, "Sometimes people hold on until they know the person they love is not alone anymore." I sat beside Mom's bed with my hand under hers, feeling how light her fingers had become. Near dawn, she opened her eyes and looked past me, toward the window. "Cabin 9, she whispered. I leaned closer. "What about it?" But she was already gone somewhere I could not follow. At the time, I thought she was confused. Later, I would understand she had never been clearer. After that, there was no time to fall apart. Grief had paperwork. Grief had phone calls. Grief had death certificates, funeral arrangements, bank notifications, hospice forms, utility bills, refund checks for guests who had known my parents for 30 years and cried harder on the phone than some relatives did. I called Samuel Pike, our family attorney. His assistant answered first, then put him through without making me wait. "I'm sorry, Maren," he said. I believed him. Samuel was not the kind of man who filled silence with decoration. He told me there would be a formal reading once Tessa arrived. Friday at 10. His office. All named parties present. All named parties? I asked. There was a pause, just long enough for me to notice. "Yes," he said. "Bring whatever records you have." I looked around the Marina office, the corkboard, the ledger, the locked file cabinet, the unpaid invoices I had been planning to handle before everything that mattered became secondary to death certificates and signatures. Then I called my sister. It was 2:40, 3 inches the morning in Michigan, which meant it was barely after midnight in Arizona. Tessa answered on the 5th ring, annoyed and half asleep. "Maren." I stood in the hospice hallway under fluorescent lights, with Mom's sweater folded over my arm and a plastic bag of her medications at my feet. "Mom's gone," I said. The line went quiet. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then Tessa asked, "Did Dad ever update the beneficiary forms?" "Not." Was she in pain? "Not." "Are you alone?" "Not." "Do you need me?" Beneficiary forms. Mom's sweater was still warm over my arm. And my sister was already counting. Tessa said she would come as soon as she could. That meant 3 days. She arrived Thursday afternoon, less than 20 hours before Samuel Pike was scheduled to read the will. By then, I had already met with the funeral director, approved the obituary, called every cabin guest booked for the next 2 weeks, and arranged for Clint Rourke to check the heaters in the winter storage buildings. The Marina still needed to breathe. Boats did not care that my father was gone. Pipes did not stop freezing because my mother had died. Tessa's rental SUV turned into the gravel lot just after 3. She stepped out wearing a camel coat, dark sunglasses, and boots with heels too thin for December gravel. Quinton came around from the driver's side with his phone already in his hand. He did not look at me first. He looked past me, toward the shoreline. "How much frontage?" he asked. Not hello. Not I'm sorry. Frontage. Tessa gave me a quick hug, the kind people give at networking events when they do not want makeup on their collar. Then she pulled back and looked toward the office, the cabins, the dock, the house beyond the pines. "This place looks exactly the same," she said. She did not say it like a daughter coming home. She said it like a buyer finding deferred maintenance. Quinton walked the property before he took his suitcase inside. I watched him stop near the fuel dock, lift his phone, and take a slow video sweep of the waterline. He paused at the storage buildings, then at cabin 9, then at the narrow strip of land where Dad had planted beach grass to keep the bank from washing out. I heard him say into the phone, low but not low enough, "Lakefront like this doesn't stay underused for long." Underused. That was the first word he gave my parents' life. Inside the house, Tessa moved through the rooms with a strange, careful confidence. She opened cabinets, checked closets, ran one finger along the mantel and looked at the dust like it was evidence against me. In Mom's room, she stood before the dresser mirror and picked up Elaine's pearl earrings, turning them in her palm. She never wore these, Tessa said. She wore them every Easter, I said. Tessa's face flickered, then smoothed out. Well, I wasn't here every Easter. No, she was not. That night, after Marisol Vega dropped off a casserole and left with wet eyes, Quinton opened his laptop on Mom's kitchen table. The same table where I had sorted pill bottles and insurance notices. On his screen was an aerial map of Whitlock Harbor. Cabin 9 had a red circle around it. The fuel dock was marked Remove. The storage buildings were marked Clear. Tessa stood behind him with her arms crossed and said, Maren, don't be sentimental. You've done your part. Nobody is taking that from you. It sounded generous if you did not understand what she meant. You did the work. Now, move aside. And Friday at 10 was still coming. Friday came with a hard blue sky and frost on the truck windshield. I was up before 6 because habit did not understand probate. I checked the office pipes, walked the dock with a flashlight, and made sure the space heaters in the storage buildings were still running. Then I changed into the only blazer I owned, navy. Bought years earlier for a hospital administration interview I never made it to because Mom had a dialysis complication that same morning. Samuel Pike's office sat above a pharmacy on Main Street, in a brick building with narrow stairs and radiators that clicked like old bones. I had been there before for lease agreements, insurance forms, and the fuel dock permit renewal. Dad always pretended he understood until Samuel explained it twice. That morning, the conference room door was open. Samuel stood at the head of the table with a leather briefcase beside him and a neat stack of documents in front of his chair. He wore the same gray suit he wore to my parents' memorial. His face gave away nothing. Morning, Maren, he said. Marisol Vega was already seated near the window, hands folded around a paper cup of coffee. Clint Rourke sat beside her in his clean work jacket, the one without oil stains, which meant he had dressed up as much as Clint knew how. Evelyn Cho from the credit union was there too, a slim folder placed squarely in front of her. I stopped in the doorway. Why are they here? I asked before I could stop myself. Samuel looked at me, then at the empty chairs across the table. Your parents asked them to be. That was all he said. Tessa and Quinton arrived at 9:57. Tessa wore black, but not funeral black. Expensive black. Courtroom black. Quinton carried a leather portfolio and had the same calm expression he'd had while marking my father's fuel dock for removal. Tessa saw Marisol first, then Clint, then Evelyn. What is this? She asked. A town meeting? Samuel did not smile. Please sit down. Tessa took the center chair like it had been reserved for her. Quinton sat close enough that their elbows almost touched. I sat across from them with my hands in my lap, trying not to look at Samuel's briefcase. He began with the formal language. Full names, dates, declarations, sound mind, final wishes. The words moved through the room slowly, like cold water under ice. Then he read the first bequest. To our daughter, Tessa Whitlock Baird, we leave the primary residence at 44 Harbor Road, including all furnishings and personal property therein, Roy's 2009 Ford pickup, and the sum of $360,000 from our joint savings account. Tessa exhaled through her nose. Not relief exactly. Confirmation. Quinton touched her wrist under the table. Samuel continued. This bequest is subject to a residency condition. Tessa Whitlock Baird must reside in the primary residence for a minimum of 4 consecutive years and may not sell, lease, transfer, or otherwise encumber the property during that period. Failure to meet this condition will result in the residence reverting according to the separate estate instrument. Tessa's smile thinned. 4 years? She said. Samuel looked over his glasses. That is what your parents wrote. Quinton leaned forward. What about the cabins? Samuel turned a page. The direct bequests in this portion are concluded. The room changed. Not loudly. Just enough. Tessa stared at him. That's it? Quinton's voice sharpened. The marina, the dock rights, the storage buildings, the commercial shoreline access. Where are those listed? Samuel placed the first document flat on the table. Not in this portion of the will. Tessa looked at me then, finally. Her eyes were bright, not with grief, with suspicion. Samuel reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a second envelope. It was cream-colored, thick, sealed across the back. "There is," he said, "a second envelope." Tessa laughed first. Not loudly. Just enough to make sure I heard it. "A second envelope," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Let me guess. Mom and Dad left Maren a thank you note for being the help with a key." Quinton let out a small breath through his nose. The kind of laugh men use when they want to seem too polite to laugh. Evelyn Cho looked down at her folder. Clint's jaw tightened. Marisol closed her eyes for half a second. I kept my hands still in my lap. The help with a key. That was what 10 years became, in my sister's mouth. The 5 a.m. fuel deliveries. The midnight heater failures. The pill bottles. The bank statements. The guests who called me before they called their own children. A key. A useful little thing someone hands to the person who locks up after everyone important leaves. Samuel broke the seal. The sound was small, paper tearing against paper, but the room seemed to lean toward it. Inside was not a check. Not a deed with my name in gold letters. Not anything dramatic enough to satisfy Tessa. Samuel withdrew a single sheet of heavy paper, a smaller folded note, and a printed access code attached to a file number. Tessa looked at it and smiled again. "That's it?" she said. "A code?" Quinton glanced at Samuel. "Is this some kind of safe deposit box situation?" Samuel did not answer him. He unfolded the smaller note first. His eyes moved once across the page, and something in his face softened. "This note is in Elaine Whitlock's handwriting," he said. Then he read it aloud. "For the daughter who knew where the winter keys were kept." I felt the words before I understood them. Behind my ribs, in my throat, in the palms of my hands. Tessa's smile disappeared. Samuel placed the note on the table and picked up the formal document. The file number corresponds to the Whitlock Shoreline Legacy Trust, established by Roy and Elaine Whitlock 5 years prior to Roy Whitlock's death. Quinton sat up. Samuel continued, each word measured. "The trust includes 12 rental cabins, 42 boat slips, 2 winter storage buildings, the fuel dock license, commercial shoreline rights, the Marina Maintenance Investment Account, and the Whitlock Marine Trades Scholarship Fund. Current estimated value, based on last quarter's valuation, is $19.2 million. No one moved. Not Tessa. Not Quinton. Not me. Then Tessa whispered, 19 million? 19.2, Samuel said. He turned the page. The designated trustee must have worked or resided at Whitlock Harbor for 6 consecutive operating seasons, maintained verifiable records for marina and cabin operations, received financial clearance from the local credit union, and demonstrated direct caregiving responsibility for Roy or Elaine Whitlock during their final years. Each condition entered the room like a lock turning. Samuel looked up. The designated trustee is Maren Whitlock. For a moment, nobody spoke. Tessa was staring at Samuel as if the words had been read in another language. Quinton's face had gone still in a way I had never seen before. Not calm, calculating. There is a difference. Calm rests. Calculation searches for a door. He found the wrong one. "This is impossible," he said, pushing back from the table. "We already had a buyer." The room went quiet in a different way. Tessa turned her head slowly. "Quinton." But the sentence was already out. Samuel set the trust document down with both hands flat on either side of it. "A buyer for what, Mr. Baird?" Quinton's mouth tightened. "A potential buyer. A preliminary conversation. Nothing binding." Evelyn Cho opened her folder. She did not rush. That was what made it worse. She slid one printed email across the table toward Samuel, then placed a second page beside it. I recognized the top line before I read the rest. North Lake Meridian Development. Chikago, Illinois. Samuel read silently for several seconds. Tessa looked at the papers, then at Quinton, then at me, like somehow I had placed them there. Evelyn's voice was careful. This was forwarded to the credit union yesterday because our institution is listed in the financing verification chain. It appears to reference Whitlock Harbor assets as available for private sale. Quinton reached for the paper. Samuel moved it out of his reach. $15.7 million, Samuel said. Tessa's hand went to the edge of the table. I remembered the red circles on Quinton's aerial map. Cabin 9. The fuel dock. The storage buildings. Remove. Clear. I remembered him standing on my parents' shoreline, calling it underused before their funeral flowers had even wilted. Samuel looked at Quinton. Did you represent to North Lake Meridian that Mrs. Baird had authority to sell or negotiate these assets? Quinton's voice came out sharper. She was the eldest daughter. We had every reason to believe. No, Samuel said. One word. It landed harder than shouting would have. You had every reason to wait until today. Tessa turned on Quinton then. You told me the paperwork was standard. It was an expression of interest, he snapped. You signed it. You said it would prove we were serious. You wanted leverage. You wanted commission. There it was. The marriage voice. Not the public one. Not the polished one they had brought into the room that morning. The private, ugly voice that comes out when two people realize the same plan cannot save them both. I sat still. I had spent years answering phone calls from guests whose deposits were missing, from doctors whose forms needed one more signature, from suppliers who wanted payment before delivery. I knew what panic sounded like when it tried to dress itself as procedure. Quinton looked back at Samuel. This is a family matter. Samuel's eyes did not move. Attempting to market trust, protected property without authority, is not merely a family matter. Tessa's face changed then. For the first time since she came home, she looked less like a woman claiming an inheritance, and more like a woman realizing she had been standing on thin ice, and under her, the lake was starting to crack. Tessa did not sit down. She lowered herself into the chair, like her legs had stopped taking instructions from her. Quinton stayed standing for another second, then seemed to realize no one was following him anywhere. He sat too. The room had changed shape around them. 10 minutes earlier, they had walked in expecting numbers to bend toward them. Now every number on the table had teeth. Samuel let the silence settle before he reached back into the envelope. There is one more document, he said. Tessa's eyes lifted. More? A personal addendum, Samuel said. Your parents asked that it be read aloud after the trust designation, with both daughters present. I looked at the folded pages in his hand and felt something inside me go very still. My mother's voice had been gone for less than 2 weeks. My father's chair at home still held the shape of him. And here, in a lawyer's office above a pharmacy, paper was about to do what grief had not allowed them to do in person. Samuel unfolded the letter. To our daughters, he read, We love you both. We have never loved one daughter less because she left, and we have never loved one daughter more because she stayed. But love and trust are not the same thing. Tessa's mouth tightened. Samuel continued, Tessa, we gave you distance because you kept asking for freedom. We helped with apartments, fresh starts, business courses, and the years when pride kept you from calling until the rent was due. We do not regret helping you. You are our daughter. The house and the savings are not a punishment. They are an invitation. Come home if you want to understand what this place is. Tessa looked down at her hands. For the first time, I saw something almost human cross her face. Not remorse. Not yet. Recognition, maybe. The faint discomfort of hearing the truth from people she could no longer interrupt. Samuel turned the page. Maren, the trust is not a reward. It is a responsibility. You carried schedules, ledgers, prescriptions, cancellations, repairs, tax forms, winter calls, and summer complaints, without asking us to call it sacrifice. We saw you. We saw every quiet thing. My eyes burned, but I did not wipe them. I thought about the nights I had fallen asleep at the office desk with Medicare forms under my arm. I thought about Mom watching me from the kitchen doorway, saying nothing. I thought silence meant she was tired. Maybe she had been recording proof in her heart long before she ever put it on paper. Samuel's voice lowered. The money is not the inheritance. The inheritance is knowing what must never be sold. Clint looked away. Marisol pressed a tissue to her mouth. Even Evelyn, professional Evelyn, blinked too fast. Tessa whispered, "They made me sound awful." Samuel looked at her over the pages. "No," he said gently. "They told you the truth." Tessa stared at Samuel like the word truth had offended her more than the trust. Then she turned to me. It was almost impressive how quickly her face rearranged itself. The shock was still there, pale around her mouth, but something else moved in behind it. Strategy. She had not gotten the Shoreline. She had not gotten the Marina. So now she was going to try another door. "Well," she said, smoothing the front of her black jacket, "then we should manage it together. No apology. No pause. Together." Quinton looked at her, caught up, and nodded too fast. "That makes sense. Maren knows the day-to-day. Tessa has broader experience. We can form an advisory structure." Samuel did not respond. Tessa leaned forward, voice softening in the way it used to when she wanted Mom to mail another check. "Maren, come on. Mom and Dad wouldn't want this to divide us. It's $19 million. You can't expect me to just sit here and pretend I'm fine with being handed a house with conditions while you control everything else." I looked at the document on the table. 12 cabins, 42 slips, 2 storage buildings, a fuel dock license that took years to secure, a scholarship fund my parents had built dollar by dollar, maintenance reserves, insurance accounts, conservation restrictions. Control was not the word for it. "It isn't mine to spend," I said. Tessa laughed once, sharp and dry. "Please don't do that." "Do what?" "Act noble. You won." The room went colder than the weather outside. I had not won anything. Winning was confetti. Winning was champagne. Winning was sleeping through the night because no one's oxygen machine beeped from the next room. This was not winning. This was being handed every fragile thing my parents had protected, and being told not to drop it. Evelyn opened her folder again. "The trust accounts require restricted use. Operating expenses, payroll, maintenance, insurance, scholarship distributions, and approved preservation costs. No personal withdrawals." Quinton's jaw worked. "There are always ways to restructure." Samuel looked at him. "Not this trust." Tessa ignored him. Her eyes stayed on me. "You're really going to sit on $19 million while your sister gets leftovers?" Clint Rourke's hand came down on the table. Not hard enough to be violent. Hard enough to make every pen jump. "There are no leftovers here," he said. Tessa blinked at him like she had forgotten mechanics, could speak in rooms with lawyers. Clint's voice was rough. "Your dad rebuilt that dock twice, with Maren holding the light after dark. Your mother kept guests coming back because she remembered who needed railings and who couldn't climb steps anymore. And when both of them got sick, Maren kept the place open. You want to call that leftovers, fine, but don't call it family." Marisol wiped under one eye, then looked at Tessa. "Elaine knew what she was signing," she said. "I was there. She was clear. Roy was clear. They were sad, Tessa, not confused." Tessa's lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time, the room did not belong to the loudest person in it. It belonged to the records, the witnesses, the years, and all the quiet things my sister had mistaken for nothing. Tessa was the first to stand. She did it too fast, like leaving the room might stop the documents from existing. Her chair scraped back, her purse slipped off the table, and for 1 second she looked at it on the floor as if she expected someone else to pick it up for her. No one did. Quinton reached for the portfolio, but Samuel placed one hand over the email printouts before he could slide them away. "These remain with me," Samuel said. Quinton's face tightened. "Those were preliminary. They were forwarded to a financial institution connected to a protected trust," Evelyn said. "That makes them part of the record." Tessa looked between them, then at me. The anger came back because anger was easier than embarrassment. "This isn't over, Maren." I had heard that sentence before in different forms. From insurance companies denying claims, From guests demanding refunds after breaking rules, from suppliers who wanted cash before delivery. It always meant the same thing. I do not have power in this moment, so I am borrowing it from the future. I did not answer. Samuel did. If you intend to contest the trust, you may file through probate court. I would advise you to consult independent counsel before doing so. Quinton took Tessa by the elbow. She led him for 3 steps, then shook him off in the hallway. Their voices rose before the conference room door even closed. You said this was clean, she snapped. I said it looked clean based on what you told me. What I told you? You were the one who called Northlake, and you were the one who signed. The stares swallowed the rest. The room stayed still after they left. Not peaceful, just emptied of performance. Samuel gathered the trust documents and placed them back in order. I'll begin the trustee confirmation filings this afternoon, he said. There will be procedures, notices, deadlines, nothing dramatic, but it will take time. Nothing dramatic. I almost laughed. By Monday, the town already knew. Not because I told anyone. Small towns do not need announcements. They survive on doorways, coffee counters, and people who say, I probably shouldn't repeat this, right before repeating everything. Quinton's Chikago developer called Samuel before noon. By Tuesday, they had sent a formal demand for clarification and reimbursement of evaluation costs. Tessa stopped answering Marisol's calls. She lasted in the house for 23 days. 23 days of heating oil bills, a septic alarm, a roof leak over the north bedroom, and guests who still came to the office asking for me. On the 24th morning, I walked back into Whitlock Harbor before sunrise. The new security panel blinked beside the office door. I entered my code. This time, it opened. 3 months later, the office smelled like fresh coffee, printer ink, and thawing wood. March does that in northern Michigan. It does not arrive all at once. It loosens one thing at a time. Ice at the edge of the dock. Snow sliding off the storage roofs. The first gull brave enough to sound ridiculous over gray water. I had moved back into the main house after Tessa left, but I did not rush to make it mine. I put Dad's mug back beside the sink. I left Mom's cardigan on the hook by the door. Some things do not need to be claimed to belong. The first checks from the Whitlock Marine Trade Scholarship Fund went out on a Wednesday afternoon. 4 of them. $15,000 each. One to a boy from Elk Rapids, who wanted to become a diesel mechanic. One to a girl whose grandfather had fished our dock every summer until his knees gave out. 2 to students from families who had spent their lives fixing things other people used and never noticed. I signed each check at Mom's old desk. My hand shook on the first one. Not because of the money. Because for the first time, I understood what my parents had done. They had not left me a fortune. They had left me a machine that could keep doing good if I kept my hands steady. Cabin 9 reopened in late March for a couple named Walter and June Hensley. Walter was a Vietnam veteran. June had called in January and asked, carefully, if the place was still family-run. I told her yes, she cried before she hung up. Before they arrived, I went into cabin 9 alone. I opened the drawer where Mom had hidden the letter. It was empty now, but I stood there for a while anyway, looking at the morning light coming through the east window. Gold, just like she had always said. Tessa called once. I was on the porch, watching Clint teach a 17-year-old Summer hire how to coil dock line properly. My sister did not say hello. Is there any way I can get more from the trust? I closed my eyes. No, I said. But there is still a way to come home. Silence. Then, she hung up. I set the phone down and listened to the lake. The ice was breaking in thin, quiet lines, not dramatic, not sudden. Just giving way because the season had changed. My parents did not hide $19.2 million from my sister because they hated her. They hid it from anyone who could look at the water and see only what it was worth. I inherited the work, and for the first time in my life, that felt like being chosen. Stories like Maren's remind us that not every inheritance comes with a number printed beside it. Sometimes the most valuable thing a parent leaves behind is not a house, a bank account, or land with a view. Sometimes it is proof. Proof that the quiet years mattered. Proof that the late nights, the unpaid sacrifices, the forms filled out at kitchen tables, the medicine schedules, the repaired doors, the meals made without applause, and the responsibilities carried without complaint were seen. In many families, the loudest person gets called successful. The one who leaves gets better stories. The one who stays gets handed the keys, the bills, the hard conversations, and the work nobody posts online. But life has a way of remembering what people try to overlook. Character leaves records too. Not always on paper. Sometimes in the people who trusted you, the place that still stands because of you, and the peace you feel when you know you did not abandon what needed you. This story is not really about $19 million. It is about the difference between wanting something and being worthy of it. Tessa wanted the inheritance because she saw value. Maren received responsibility because she understood meaning. That is a lesson many of us learn the hard way. Family is not proven by last names, birth order, or who speaks with the most confidence. Family is proven by who shows up when there is nothing glamorous to gain. And maybe that is the deepest truth here. Being overlooked does not mean being invisible. Being quiet does not mean being weak. Staying does not mean failing. Sometimes, staying is the strongest thing a person can do. So if you have ever been the one who carried more than anyone noticed, this story is for you. Your work matters. Your loyalty matters. Your patience matters. Even when nobody claps for it, it is building something. What part of Maren's story hit you the hardest? Have you ever seen someone in a family get ignored until they were needed? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories about family, betrayal, resilience, and the quiet strength it takes to start over.